Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Today, I wanted to reintroduce the subject of Antifa, which to me is a fascinating subject. Antifa began in Germany, and then it migrated to the U.S. The symbology is very similar from Germany to the US, but the histories are a little bit different. To my mind, that really doesn't matter that much. Um, the basic idea of Antifa, whether in Germany or in the US, is essentially the same, namely an opposition to fascism, which is why it's called Antifa, right? Antifa, anti-fascism, not as Donald Trump mispronounces it, Antifa. There is no such thing as Antifa. Antifa is not an acronym for anything, at least not as far as I know. But Antifa, um, in its opposition to fascism, lays down an essential prerequisite, in my view, for the establishment of communism. The major contradiction in capitalism is imperialism, and fascism is one of the major ways in which imperialism manifests. Or one could go even further and say that fascism is essentially a synonym for imperialism. It depends on how precise you want to get. Obviously, the fascism started by Mussolini is long gone. And so we have the freedom to redefine it in a way that makes sense in the 21st century. We are not bound by Mussolini and his own idea of fascism, and we are certainly not bound by the fascism of Adolf Hitler called Nazism. In case you didn't know, Hitler himself was a disciple of Benito Mussolini before he began his own approach to Nazism. The only reason why Hitler was willing to accept the term Nazism, National Socialism, a German acronym, is because he redefined socialism as German nationalism. A lot of people, especially on the far right, and I wonder sometimes whether they may be people who themselves are fascists or Nazis, but I have no way of knowing that, have argued, well, see, Hitler was basically a socialist. He was a national socialist. And they are using the word socialist the way it has generally been understood in the Western world. But that's not true. Hitler did not coin the term Nazism. Instead, he adopted it. He took over the Nazi movement and he simply made it into a movement about German nationalism, super German nationalism, mythic German nationalism. By mythic, I mean the idea that Germans are somehow the descendants of the Aryan race, which clearly, at least not in any kind of direct sense, which clearly they are not. If any nation comes close to being Aryan, it is Iran for two reasons. First, which is really not that important, that the name Iran is how you say Aryan in Persian. It's the same word. Aryan and Iran are cognates. That's just a term for Aryan in Persian. The second reason, which is more important, is that when you look at the territory of the Aryans, that territory overlapped considerably with modern day Iran. And so Iran, I would suggest, has a much bolder claim to being Aryan than does Germany. And there are other problems too. I mean, Hitler had brown or black hair. I mean, when he did his breeding program consisted of people with blonde hair. So I guess if he were in the breeding program, it would have excluded him. Uh, Hitler was not only evil, which of course he was, but he was extremely inconsistent. And his philosophy, his political theology, whatever you want to call it, literally makes no sense. But it is very rare that systems of bigotry and prejudice make sense. They are not founded on the idea of rationality. They are based upon hatred, and both fascism and especially Nazism are systems of hatred before they are anything else. So I think that's a good place to begin to see the kind of mythic aspect to Nazism, this mythic idea that Germans are somehow magically Aryans when clearly they are not. And the fact that the word Aryan and Iran are cognates. So I think those two things kind of leaves out Germany. I mean, Germany is not within walking distance or even a very easy driving distance. I guess you could drive there, but it would take a while to get from Germany to Iran. They are two very different, very distinct cultures, and cultures that are also far removed from one another geographically. Okay. The primary purpose of this podcast is to argue that there are really two types of Antifa, or at least that there should be two types of Antifa. Whether there are now, I don't know. Maybe I should put it in the second way, because basically what I am doing is I am proposing a new type of Antifa. But I think it is a type of Antifa which makes sense, especially in the context of Maoism-Third worldism. Antifa, as commonly understood, is an opposition to authoritarianism. If you look at Mussolini, if you look at Hitler, they were concerned with the West. They were concerned primarily with Europe, and secondarily maybe with the United States, but not that much. So their idea of authoritarianism really was authority over the Western world, and a kind of belligerent authority, which is why Germany led the foundation for the Second World War, along with Japan and along with Italy. Those three countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan, made up a single alliance, and they were opposed to the alliance of the United States and Britain and Canada and so forth. And that was why World War II happened. Nobody expected a Second World War. Most writers argued that the First World War had solved all the problems, and there was never going to be another World War. Well, problem. Before World War I, the average view among people was that we had literally outgrown the need for war. There would never be a war again. We had simply gotten too mature. That illusion, or I guess delusion, was shattered with the start of World War I. I don't know anybody who was in World War I that well. I have met people over the years who were. My father was in World War II. He was never fighting the Nazis. He fought in New Guinea, Philippines, and in Australia. And he told me that he knows of at least 3 Japanese soldiers that he killed. When I asked him, which I guess is a kind of silly question, considering war is war, why he killed those 3 Japanese soldiers, he responded in a relatively fair way. He said, well, it was either them or it was me. I mean, what else can you say? Yeah, of course. That's the way war is. War is a battle for survival. And yeah, on the plane of war, when you're fighting in a war, your brothers are your brothers in arms. Your brothers look out for you, and you look out for them. That's the way wars are. A lot of people sign up for wars thinking that they will be, of all things, fun. Wars are never fun. They are always tragic. You lose people. Sometimes you even lose your own mind. But the idea that war is fun is one which is often spread by countries in order to encourage people to fight in wars, to present wars as wonderful and enjoyable and fulfilling and important. Well, I guess they can be important, but wonderful and fulfilling? Definitely not. I have never served in a war, whether against the Nazis, the fascists, or anyone else. I am immensely grateful for that. When I was in high school, I used to think about what would happen if I got drafted into the Vietnam War. Why? Because my lottery number was 3. 3. That was on a scale of 1 to 365. And the lower your lottery number, the more quickly you will be drafted into the Vietnam, or as it is sometimes called, the Indochina War. So, not thinking clearly, which I'll explain in a second, I decided that if I were drafted into Nam, that I would flee the US, as did many other Americans, and go to Canada. But in reality, I had no need to worry about that, because with my then misdiagnosis, or whatever you want to call it, of schizophrenia childhood type, which was the name given to autism in those days, I would never have been drafted. I would have automatically been kicked out. They would not have wanted me to fight in the war. Why that never occurred to me, I have no idea, but it didn't. Let's get back to Antifa and why I think that Antifa needs to be rethought, reformulated, reimagined for the 21st century. It is not sufficient that I, as an American, oppose fascism and racism in the United States. That is not to say it is unimportant. Of course it's important, but that's not all there is to it. If I just stop at opposing racism and authoritarianism and militarism in the United States, then where will I be? The United States has, for a long time, been a knee-jerk fascist country for a variety of reasons. One, the common belief among Americans that America is the best country in the world. The extreme nationalism among Americans on average. Nationalism is a belief in the superiority of one's own nation over others. It should not be confused with patriotism, which is pride in one's country. Now, honestly, as I've said before, I am neither nationalistic nor patriotic, but I don't have any kind of animosity toward patriotism in general. I don't like it, but I'm not hostile to it. I do have a strong animosity toward nationalism, especially concerning the most corrupt and dangerous country in the world, the one I was born into, the United States of America. So I could never be nationalistic, and again, for that matter, I could never be patriotic. So that element of nationalism is one of the main reasons why the United States has that kind of seed of fascism in it. Another is this kind of mythic history, which so many Americans accept. And it takes many forms and goes in many directions. One, the idea that America is the best country in the world, again, that nationalistic idea. That's very mythic, very mythological, has no basis in reality. The idea that Columbus discovered America when he did not. Columbus was the conqueror, not the discoverer of America. The Roman Empire and the Vikings were here before. The Native Americans were here even before that. So Columbus may have discovered America for himself and his crew, but that's about it. Columbus was not the discoverer of America. That's, I think, something that there is little controversy surrounding, I hope, these days. The myth of Thanksgiving. A lot of Native Americans despise Thanksgiving, and for good reason. What do Native Americans have to be thankful for? After all, they were a conquered and defeated people. They were at various times forbidden from speaking their own languages, from practicing their own religions. They were taken off their lands, moved to other places. And when reservations were established for some Native American tribes or nations, not all of them, very frequently, those reservations were nowhere near the original lands that those people had originally occupied. One of the main characteristics of indigenous people, many indigenous people, is an attachment to the land, an idea of the land as sacred territory. And Native Americans, like Aboriginal and indigenous people all over the world, have been historically separated from the land. So why would a Native American like Thanksgiving? I mean, I don't like Thanksgiving for the same reason. I like the food, and admittedly, maybe I shouldn't do it, but I go out and I will have a Thanksgiving meal simply because I like to pig out. That's the only reason. Maybe I'm admitting something that I should not admit. Maybe I should not do that. I agree that that's probably true, but will I go to Thanksgiving this coming November? Most likely, yes, because I like to eat a lot, and my big belly shows it. So Thanksgiving gives a kind of mythic uh, story to the origin of America. The notion that somehow, even though there is no evidence to support it, that America is the land of the free. Free from what? Free from what? We are certainly not free from racism. Even more, we are certainly not free from capitalism, or from imperialism, or from sexism, or ageism, or adultism. We are enmeshed in the capitalist world system, which carries its own set of disgusting mythologies. And so many Americans willingly buy into them. Finally, a point I made just a couple of weeks ago, the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, pure mythology. There never was a Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a Turkish Cuban Missile Crisis, but not a Cuban Missile Crisis. Why? Because the United States placed nukes in Turkey, and the Soviet Union under Khrushchev placed nukes in Cuba. And we neglect that fact of our history when we talk about the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. In other words, we blame the Soviet Union. That's a part of the Cold War rhetoric. You blame Russia. Always blame Russia. Now, I am not trying to exalt one nation or another. I recognize that all nations have their failings, and in some cases, their beneficial aspects as well. I admit that there are some aspects of American culture that I find praiseworthy, but I also admit that I find them to be so few that I have to pause for a long time before I can come up with any. So when I look at that aspect of American history, I ask myself again, what is there about American history, about the United States, that is fascistic? And the answer is America itself. We are basically a fascistic country, and we have been for a very long time. It is in the makeup, in the fabric of our country that we are fascistic. Without fascism, the US would be an entirely different thing. I can't even conceive of a United States without fascism. Having lived here my entire life and having hated it for most of that time, admittedly, America without fascism is inconceivable to me. It's something that I cannot imagine at all, at all. So if I see the United States as being fascistic, and then going further, if I see the United States as being the leader of the so-called free world, the leader of NATO, the most powerful country in the world, militarily and economically, a country which has spent many of its most powerful resources, mostly economic, in fighting communism, which has tried repeatedly during Fidel's lifetime to assassinate him, which has a history of opposition, especially to left wing, or what it perceives to be left wing, often they're not, governments. But not only left wing governments. I mean, look at what we did in Iran in 1953. We overturned the legitimately elected president of that country because we disliked that country's plans to nationalize its oil. And so we did that, I guess, as a favor to the oil industry. When Eisenhower, whom I admire in some ways, not in all ways, referred to the United States as the military-industrial complex, he knew what he was talking about. He was right. The military and private industry have for decades worked hand in hand. And if Eisenhower were still alive today, I imagine he would be even more critical, because that military-industrial complex has become even more deep-seated than it was back during his presidency. And Eisenhower made that famous statement regarding the military-industrial complex in his famous farewell speech. When questioned about it, he said, you know, I really wanted to say the military-industrial congressional complex, but I didn't think I had enough time. I'm not sure if that would have added much to it. Military-industrial complex makes the point. I guess congressional adds something to it. Why not add presidential too? I mean, or whatever. I mean, there are so many different aspects of the US, which in my view is literally the most corrupt nation in the world, that he could have added, that calling it the military-industrial complex without adding other qualifiers, I mean, I really don't care that much. What I do care about is the third world. I love the third world passionately. I say that to people, like I said it to someone today. It was in a meeting that we had on Zoom. And I was saying that the United States is not going to lead the world anywhere, that position will ultimately fall to the third world. He accused me of being too negative. And I said, no, I'm not being negative. I'm being positive because I love the third world. At that point, he had no idea of what to say. That was obvious from his facial expression. And so he simply stopped talking, which I think at that point was the appropriate thing to do. Now, this guy is a friend, not an enemy. I see him every week on Zoom. We know each other fairly well, but I don't think that we agree about that much. I don't think that we have similar views or a similar perspective on world events, but how many people are going to agree with me anyway? I mean, I am a Maoist-Third worldist and a Bhaskarian critical realist. I mean, that puts me way, way, way outside the Oberton's window. I mean, I'm not even on the edges of it. So, when I think of fascism, when I think of Antifa, the enemy of fascism, what I think of is the importance not only of fighting authoritarianism in this country, which I think is valid. For example, fighting the oppression of African Americans. Yeah, that's a good thing to do. Why not? I was a part of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. I'm an old man. So I have always loved the civil rights movement. And I have supported it through every step it has taken. I loved Martin Luther King Jr., but to be honest, I liked Malcolm X even more. But either way, both of them were giants, heroes of the civil rights movement. And so I certainly think that there is tremendous value in supporting the fight against fascism, Antifa, in the United States. Why not? We should fight fascism everywhere. But the most important fight, in my opinion, does not lie within the United States per se. It lies between the United States and the Third World. What I mean by that is the power which is exerted by the US and its allies against the Third World. I really believe that if there were no First World, especially if the belly of the beast, the United States, did not exist, because without the belly of the beast, I don't think that the First World would be able to run effectively. But certainly without the First World in general. If that were to happen, I think that the Third World, which already has a great deal of class consciousness, which already has seen a lot of the contradictions of capitalism, primarily imperialism, the major contradiction of capitalism, then I do think that the Third World, or at least some countries in the Third World, would begin revolutions against the capitalist world system. Now, is there any guarantee that that will happen? No. There are no guarantees of anything. I mean, literally, a big asteroid can hit the Earth tomorrow and blow us all to smithereens. That could happen. Well, I don't think it will, but I guess it could. We could all die in some other way. Nothing is certain in this world. We live in a world governed by probabilities, and probabilities are never precise. They are always governed by chance. And however small the chance statistically of anything happening, that does not mean that it can't happen. So it is certainly possible that we might destroy ourselves. You know, sometimes I really wish we would. I know that's a dire thought, not a positive thing to say, but I really do wish that sometimes that we would simply throw ourselves into into the pit and watch ourselves become extinguished, because I so often lose hope in the ability of the of the first world anyway to really accomplish anything meaningful. And as long as the first world is in power, the third world will be completely hampered in any attempt it might make to establish socialism or communism. I mean, there is dialectical or revolutionary potential all around the world, including here in the United States. But I would say that in the United States and in the first world, that dialectical and revolutionary potential is so meager that it would not allow us to break free of the capitalist world system. The capitalist world system has a stranglehold on the first world. Many corporations are more powerful than many countries. So I literally don't see how that is possible, how the first world could simply even attempt it, or why it would even attempt it. What motivation would it have? The third world undoubtedly has a lot of motivation, but every time it has tried to break free of the US stranglehold, the US has unfailingly, unflinchingly come to defeat it. Every single time. Every single time. So if I were in the third world, I've been visited but not lived in, but if I lived in the third world, I think I would feel pretty negative, pretty pessimistic. But what I believe is that after the first world has gone the way of the I don't know, the mammoth, the woolly mammoth, first thing that popped into my head, that at that point the third world will have the power, the potential, the ability to challenge the authority of the first world. Because what holds the first world together is the United States. And if the United States is decapitated, that will decapitate the first world. I don't know how the empire, really the American empire, could function without the United States. So that is my hope. And that is the direction that I think Antifa should go in. Not only an opposition to domestic authoritarianism, but an opposition to the authoritarianism of the first world. And that is honestly, when I wear this cap, that is what I'm thinking of more than anything else, is my opposition, honestly, my hatred for the land in which I was born. I don't want to have that hatred. Who wants to hate one's own land? I can't think of anyone that would. Maybe there are some. I do, but it's no fun. I don't like it. It's not pleasant hating my own country, but I think that given the state of the world, given the degree of dominance that Israel and the US have shown in the last few months over Gaza, what alternative do I have than pure hatred? And I will not be afraid to do that. I have no fear of hating the land of my birth. It's not something I want. If there was some way that I could change it, I would. But the only way to change it is to decapitate the first world, meaning to eliminate the power of the United States. I'm not talking about eliminating people. I'm talking about eliminating power. The power of the United States needs to be taken away. So the third world can rise to the moment and bring about socialism and communism, and perhaps save our planet from dying from global warming. One of the greatest threats, perhaps the greatest threat that the Earth has ever faced. For the time being, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.